Wait a second. This isn't your grandma's cancer show.
Not your grandma's cancer show.
Hi, I'm Tatum, and today we are talking about losing fertility. Whether we were planning children or not, cancer and its treatment sometimes takes away the choice of a life we thought we'd have. And processing this loss at the same time as cancer can be so lonely. And that's why I've got three lovely guests on Zoom with me today. I've got Katy, who found a lump on her 5th wedding anniversary. We've got Gemma, who she had a number of coping mechanisms that she'd had before she had cancer. And then after she was diagnosed, they didn't work so well. And she was on the hunt for new ones. So we're going to find out what helped with her. And right now I've got Amanda with me, who was 37 when she was diagnosed. And Amanda, can you tell me what was going on in your life at that time?
Hi. It was a January and it was on my list of things to do. I'm a bit of a hypochondriac and I was like, I've got this random lump. Surely it's nothing. No one in my family has cancer. Like, we have big heart attacks and all that kind of diversion going on. There's like not a single person. And I have lots of other women in my life. Like, no one has lumps, no one has cancer. Just was not on my radar. And at the time I was working as a camera assistant. So that's in TV, film and drama. Incredibly stressful, difficult job. Very, very physical. So I was very independent. I was self-employed. And I've been doing it now for like 10 years, maybe a bit longer. And I was kind of hitting my stride, thinking what to do next. Do I want to go up to the next level? Do I want to set up on my own? But, very much used to getting up at 3 a.m, driving somewhere in the country, doing a 12-hour shift, doing a 16-hour shift, doing all these things. I took a lot of pride in my sort of strength. It was then pre-Me Too, very sexist industry. You had to kind of be one of the boys, listen to the jokes, carry the heavy stuff. I was kind of, I think I took a lot of my self-esteem from my strength, independence, and but I had this lump, and I just kept thinking, I kept crying in the shower, thinking this is just your anxiety. I only felt it when I was anxious, and I kept thinking, should I ask my mum? I don't. Oh. And it was like, no, come on, this is the January list of things to do: tax return, go to the doctor, and And I went to the doctor, and I'll never know. I had this lovely GP who went, well, it doesn't feel like anything serious to me, but I'll put you on the emergency list anyway. And I still want to sort of go back to her and go, what did you really think? And then funnily enough, I had a bit of a tricky diagnosis, because the consultant I went to see sort of, got your boob out, she had a feel, and she went, no, it doesn't really feel like cancer. And even at that point, with some sort of knowledge of how these things work, I thought, you shouldn't really be telling me this. And she had this student and he was allowed to touch it. And then as soon as I started having ultrasounds, mammograms, everybody's face just fell, biopsies. And you suddenly, because it's a day clinic, I went to UCH, University College Hospital, because at the time as well, I was living in central London. I was like, I love where I live in King's Cross. I felt like I was right in the heart of things. And I love UCH. It's this amazing hospital. But yes, you really feel like everything's happening at once. And within an hour, you get basically diagnosed with cancer.
Wow.
The consultant was like, oh God, I didn't expect this. And she ran out the room. I mean, if she'd have had a duvet, she'd have looked out the window and climbed down. She was so it was so unprofessional, bless her. And she just kind of handed me to the breast cancer nurse.
How did you feel about that? I mean, that all happening in the space of an hour. Was there a whiplash from that?
Definitely. And I think, as you know, there's a whiplash from the whole experience. Yes. And funnily enough, I was listening to one of your previous podcasts, and one of the contributors sort of talked about this. If you get a bit misdiagnosed, how it can really affect you. And I remember just being like, oh, yes. And I never saw that consultant again for ages. It never really occurred to me. And after, it's a busy London hospital, so you see all different people. And basically that was the worst thing I encountered. I was very lucky. And the nurses were just amazing. I remember there was this very small elderly nurse, and she could see that I was about to get told I had cancer. And she just took me away and was like, just sit down for 20 minutes. I've got your phone number. I'll come and call you. Gave me a hug. So everyone else was very careful. And funny enough, after I'd had all my treatment, or I was maybe done with chemo, I sort of found another lump. I wasn't too worried, and I just went back because, just to double check. And I had that consultant again, and I'd literally never seen her again. And I had a huge panic attack. And that's when I was like, oh, I was really affected by that.
Yeah.
And that really stayed with me, actually. And again, she just kind of got my breast and went, well, you've just got a really lumpy breast. And I was like, oh God, I'm in the same sort of situation. So I think that, that does have a knock-on effect long-term. It definitely sort of set off my anxiety.
Yeah, I mean, your life is in their hands, right? So when they're like, oh, no, and oh, yes, it jars you. You're like, oh, what can I trust now going forwards?
I had a real obsession, weirdly, real obsession of trying to find that student again. Like, how things fixate when you're really anxious about stuff again. You can fixate on certain things. And I was like, I just want to find him and go, that is what a tumour feels like. And I can only think that with my breast, it was like literally straight under the nipple, because they did have a bit of trouble sort of accessing it. And so it was almost the shape of my breast, but just quite ridgy and lumpy. And so maybe she did just think, oh, it's just a bit ridgy and lumpy. But anyway, so I walked away from that. And my poor sister, she worked nearby. And I remember just texting her because she was like, oh, I can come and see you and help. And I was like, well, I'll call you if I need you. And I just texted her like, cancer. It's cancer, because that's all I could write. And my sister was just like, and kind of came and found me. And we both sort of walked away shaking and went and had a gin and tonic in a pub next door.
I'm so glad that she was so close and you were able to get to that gin so quickly.
We both just kind of sat there like, whoa, wow.
At what point did someone mention to you that there was a risk to your fertility?
Do you know, that's an interesting question. I remember the fertility stuff happening, but I don't remember when it was first mentioned to me. And I think that's part of the thing. It slightly caught me off guard. I think the big headline when you're quite young was that I had to have a mastectomy, not a lumpectomy. And I guess there's such a sort of feeling like that's so devastating for a woman that I got a lot of help around that. And then when the IVF was offered, you're kind of transferred to another part of the hospital all of a sudden. And, you're suddenly learning that you're going to have to become really good at navigating NHS hospitals. Yeah. And they did mention taking Zoladex, which in the end I don't think I got, which would have slowed down everything while I was having the chemo. And then they did, so then I kind of got shunted down to the fertility part. And I had this, again, they were really lovely, but they really scared you. I think it was a deliberate tactic. So I had estrogen positive cancer. So, shoving me full of estrogen was scary. But they made it sound absolutely horrific. Like I was going to have all these jabs, then all these counter jabs. I was probably getting really sick. It might kill me. And I was so overwhelmed by the whole process. And I felt like I was in this kind of vice grip, like I'd been given basically 2 days to say yes or no to this treatment.
And where were you in terms of wanting to have children at that point?
So at that point in my life, I'd been in a very casual-ish relationship for probably far too long that I should, because it was just very convenient. But it wasn't a relationship really to be having children in. And I was 37 and I was thinking to myself, this probably isn't going to happen. I think living in London, I had a very close group of friends. Most of them, if they were going to get married around 30. Interestingly, their husbands were always 40. That was obviously the age of a man in London ready to commit, 10 years older than the women. And they were just starting to have kids. And I'd quite enjoy, because I work freelance, I quite often was like either away or, I'd been there when my friends, like my best friend had the baby and I was there the same day, like holding it. And so I'd had a lot of input, which was nice. And I really enjoyed being, again, that very energetic, lively auntie. And I really enjoyed being able to give my friends loads of support, bringing up your friend, like, they talk about it takes a village to raise a child. And I think I just thought that gently I probably wouldn't. I'd grown up with polycystic ovary syndrome. So there'd always been this thought of like, if you wanted to get pregnant, we probably would have had to help you anyway. So I'd always known it would have been a bit of an issue, maybe. And like I said, I was in this relationship. I couldn't see any other one on the horizon. But I think, I didn't rule it out. And I was kind of hoping, I guess, it would be a gentle slide to childlessness. And that, being childless maybe would be fine. I had all my friends. I was very active and I could take an active part in their lives. And I think to sort of suddenly be confronted with all of those feelings in 2 days.
Yeah. And
they really kept saying, you've got to hurry, you've got to make a decision. The longer you leave it, the chemo. And I just I'd gone back to my mum's to have the mastectomy, you know, to be with her, and I just kept weeping and weeping and weeping. And I could not make this decision. And my lovely friends would sit with me and talk it through. And I think I knew that I wasn't going to have kids, and I knew that I shouldn't take the money off the NHS. But I just at that point couldn't draw that line. But then on the other hand, you had all the doctors telling you it was going to be horrifically dangerous for you. And interestingly, I was a little bit annoyed, actually. I could see why they did it. But as soon as I said yes, loads of support mechanisms were put in place. And it was almost as if the nurses took like a deep, relaxing breath and were like, oh, don't worry, it's not as bad as we said. And I felt like I could have really done with that support before. I mean, that decision tore me apart. It was horrendous. And I think it slightly caught me off guard because I hadn't been like crazy child focused. But yes, so I can only think it was that knowledge in my brain that this was it. And I was slightly annoyed with myself for not just being brave enough to say, I'm not going to do the IVF. Let's just get on with chemo.
So in the end, you ended up doing the IVF.
Yeah.
And when you got to the end of treatment, did you then need to revisit kind of where you were at with things?
Yeah, I think sadly my IVF also wasn't very successful. And I had a bit of a bad time with that because I started off with the NHS and there was long queues and everything, but I always got to see really good people, brilliant nurses, brilliant consultants. And then it just so happened it was over the Easter bank holiday. And with this IVF, you know, it was so critical. I was getting my blood taken every day. And so I had to be transferred to a private clinic. And that was a totally different ball game. And I'm so anti-private medicine because of this. But it's so hard to explain to people what the difference is. I got the hot chocolates, I got the magazines, there were no queues. But I didn't see a single consultant. I just had nurses. They didn't talk to me. And no one told me anymore what was happening. And so basically they took 3.5 eggs. And I had no idea that wasn't really working, that not much was happening. And they wanted to put a positive spin on it. So I've got these lovely smiley nurses going, that's 3.5 eggs. And then when I Googled it, I was like, that's terrible. That's nothing. And, you know, they weren't being made into embryos, you know, because I wasn't in a relationship. And I slightly had to deal with that shock on my own, you know, being like, oh, after all that, actually, again, it just felt like another thing that made it increasingly unlikely. And so I had kind of reconciled myself to that. And I really struggled with chemo. Like my body just was constantly neutropenic. I was in and out of A&E. It wasn't fun. And I think by the time I came out, you know, I felt like such a shell of myself. And I now suffer from anxiety and I really struggle. And I just, you know, it's so far from my ability to be a parent in any way, which is something to come to terms with. But it just, you know, I look at my friends and how tired they are. And I'm like, I'm tired. I don't have any children.
You know, you raise a really interesting point there because sometimes, you know, there is this sort of ideal of what a, you know, and you can call it many different ways, but a child-free, I know there's a few different terms for it, life might look like. Did you feel like you were able to do that?
No. So I think, like I was saying before, when I was 37 and healthy, there's a good bit, I don't know if any of you have watched Sex and the City, but it was my like go-to piece of uselessness when my brain was all over the place. And there's a bit where one of the main characters is talking to another character about how would you deal with she's thinking about it. How would you deal with childlessness? And she's like, well, what would that look like? You know, foreign travel, partying with friends, lovely clothes. And, you know, that's not so bad. And I think now I was like, oh, what does it look like? Isolate. So I couldn't see either a fun, independent alternative either post-cancer. So whereas if I'd stayed well, I'd have had contact with kids, but equally I could have been like, do you know what? Your kids are annoying. I'm going to a bar. I'm going to go dating. I'm going to go traveling. My work is really interesting. You know, it used to take me all over the world, all over the country. I met lots of famous people. It was very stressful, but it was very interesting. And all of that had gone. And you're just left going, well, I'm living at home with my mum. And I find, you know, I don't have enough energy to see friends, maybe one friend a day, and then maybe a day off. All those things that I like to do, I'm now quite frightened of. Traveling on my own, driving on my own. I used to love driving. I used to love long drives. And now I was like, I think I'm just going to fall asleep at the wheel, you know, and all that kind of fun side of it had gone. So you're not one thing or the other anymore.
So it's a huge amount of loss. And to have those decisions made so quickly, you know, in kind of this compacted time, You can really see kind of, really illustrated that turmoil of that time. And I could see Katy nodding at several points while you were talking, Amanda. Katy, were there parts in Amanda's story that you could relate to?
Oh, so much of it. Just from the very start, Amanda, I mean, your career, I met my husband through a friend who is a camera operator, a female camera operator, for a big TV show. So all the things you were saying, I was like, I've heard all that before. I've seen all that before. I understand that lifestyle. But I think for me, particularly that point where you're consultant. So I had a very similar sort of experience where we'd gone in, was on the 2-week referral, gone in, had the mammogram, walked into the doctor's room, and she didn't even speak to me. She just put her hands all over my breast and my neck, and then she sat down. She was doing stuff on the computer, and she was just like, "I'm really worried about this. I'm really worried about this." And I walked out of her room and sat in the waiting room, waiting to go back in and have a biopsy, and then obviously everything beyond that. And I sat in the area where all the women are gowned up, and obviously everybody else is older than me, and I just started crying, and I went, "Well, don't see her. She's a bloody nightmare," So they were like, "Oh, don't worry, I've been in before. It could just be a cyst. It could be that." And I'm like, "That's not what she said," And then I was taken into a biopsy room where the nurses were talking over my head, and they were saying about putting a clip in, because it might be cancer. So at this point, nobody has spoken to me other than this sort of like manic sort of touching of my breast. And but yeah, I then went in. This is sort of a really condensed version. There's lots and lots of my experience of diagnosis I want to expand upon, but I think what I'm trying to get at is the reference to Amanda's story was that whole thing around sort of sitting back in that room with that consultant. And we've been in a position, so just to sort of explain my backstory really, my mother-in-law had only passed away from breast cancer 6 weeks prior to my diagnosis. My husband was in the room with me, and they were using all this language. It was like, here's a Macmillan nurse. And I'm sat there going, I know what a Macmillan nurse is. I'm not going to respond until you say the words cancer, because at this point, nobody's had the decency to be that clear. And then they were sort of talking about all this different, I don't know, we were concerned about it, or this or that, everything but the word cancer. And eventually they went, it's cancer, don't you? And with that, my husband slumped in the seat next to me. He looked like somebody had literally taken a baseball bat to him, and he literally just slumped in the seat. And I turned to him and I was like, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. And the nurse is saying to me, why are you apologising? And I said, because we only buried his mum to the same disease 6 weeks ago. At which point, the consultant who was yet to speak to me, or I couldn't even tell you her name, stood up and left the room because she couldn't cope.
What?
And I think in terms of what Amanda's saying, that sort of, I didn't see her again. I only saw her probably when I went for an annual mammogram or something like that, that's sort of back in that environment. But yeah.
Oh, that's just one thing after another of just failure to communicate clearly, and then to say, it's cancer. Like, like you're the clinician in the room. Like, what's like, that's, even if you're unsure if someone knows or not, you would ask a question like, can you tell me, what you're thinking at this moment? Like, what knowledge do you have at this time? Try and find that out instead of, it's cancer, which is, again, like a way that your husband also maybe didn't need to hear that news. it's just a very confusing situation. Did something similar happen when it came to someone telling you about your fertility status? Was that...
It was in the same meeting.
It was in the same meeting?
In the same meeting.
And what did they say?
So I got asked 2 questions, just again going referencing Amanda's sort of experience. So I was a double H bust, and although my tumour was the size of a plum, they were going to treat me with chemotherapy first. So it meant I could have a lumpectomy instead of the breast off, because it would have been too big surgically for the size of my bust. And it was, the conversation was, what bra size was I? And I said, I'm a 36 double H or something, whatever it was. And I hate my breasts because I'm tall and big busted. Finding clothes that fit are really difficult. And I don't like them. I love a breast reduction. They're very, very heavy and they cause me a lot of problems. So I turned around and I said, well, do me a favour though. If you're getting rid of that one, get rid of that one, because they're too much. Don't think in a million years you're going to build that one up to be the same size as the other. But we did get into a discussion quite interestingly in the room around that, because my friend who'd been diagnosed, I know a lot of women who had breast cancer before me, and one of my friends from school had actually been diagnosed with secondaries just before I was diagnosed with my primary. So again, slightly different from Amanda's story. I knew a lot of women with breast cancer. But I was talking about my friend, and I was like, but my friend was like, say for argument's sake, a C cup, and her tumour was the size of a pea, and they gave her a mastectomy. And that's when they explained it was the amount of breast tissue that I had a lot of breast tissue to play with, which meant I could have a lumpectomy instead of a mastectomy. So that was one sort of discussion, very, very rapid, as you can imagine. And then the second one was, did we have children? Were we thinking about having children? So there were a couple of things in our lives which were, we'd met when we were older. We were, Amanda, like you were saying, we were 37. I was 35 when I met her. I was 37 when we got married. So we had this viewpoint that we'd not long lived in our house, about 4 years. We had a mortgage. We'd gone out and partied as young people. So, at the end of the day, we didn't have much finances behind us. And then there'd been a number of issues, but both of us looked at it from a perspective that neither of us had children before we'd entered our relationship. We'd not had that type of lifestyle or chosen to go down that route prior to that. So when we were sort of asked the question about, do you have children? Do you want children? Do you want to harvest your eggs? Probably as quickly as that I was asked. We just looked at each other, and because we just had the experience of obviously burying my mother-in-law, we just looked at each other. My husband said to the nurse, will it delay treatment? And she said yes. And we both went, well, no, then let's, as Amanda says, let's crack on and get the treatment done. Because that was what was most prevalent in our minds. There'd been a delay in my diagnosis through the GP. I had been going to the GP and complaining of breathlessness and itchy red palms, which I now know is an indicator of raised estrogen and is an indicator towards breast cancer. But because I was double H bust, there was no lump for me to feel. So obviously it had to be a significant size for me to feel that in the bath, for me to even go to the GP, for me to even say, here's a lump. So I hadn't been referred early enough. So there were lots and lots of things going on. So
after you made that decision, so again, kind of the echoes that I can hear of Amanda's story is the speed. So you're in there and you're like, where am I in my life right now? I'm gonna make a decision. Did that change for you? Did you stick with that decision?
Well,
decide
again,
to do something
it
else?
was a bit strange. So we went back to my parents' house. So my parents obviously knew I'd gone for the mammogram, and they were waiting at home for us to go back and tell them what had happened in the appointment. And we went round, and I sort of, my dad refused to believe it. He's like, it's not, it's a cyst. I'm not having it, it's a cyst. And then I was like, well, we decided to not, go down that route. We're going to go straight for treatment, this, that, and the other. I phoned my brother. I was making a joke out of it on the phone, and I was like, well, that's it, mate. I always told you I wasn't going to have kids. Well, that's the facts now. Let's face it. And a couple of weeks later, my parents actually came in to see the surgeon with us. And my mum said to the nurse, I think Katie made a rash decision in choosing not to have her eggs harvested. And now that was my decision, and it was my decision at that point in time. But I wasn't privy to even that conversation. I was just sat in the room as my mum and my nurse were talking about it. And my nurse's response to my mother was, well, it's an estrogen. We now know it's an estrogen-driven cancer, and therefore we wouldn't want to pump her with estrogen in order to harvest her eggs. They probably won't, because of her age, they probably won't put her through IVF after treatment. But let's face it, who'd want a baby at 47 anyway?
And how did you feel in that moment?
I think that was the thing that sent me spiraling.
So you weren't 47 at that point, right?
No.
That the reason that she said that age was because
it would have been 5 years post.
5 years past. So you were 42.
Yeah.
And, people are having children at 42, 43, 44. Yeah. But because the nurse added the extra 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really, a really tough way to hear that, to have your options put out in front of you. And also, those guidelines of 5 years can change, right? Like, they're usually a case-by-case basis. That's not a hard and fast rule. And it didn't sound like that was a specialist nurse to be dishing out that information.
Yeah, I think for me, we ended up sort of a few years later, because it was obviously the one thing that sort of played on my mind really heavily. And there were lots of things. There were lots of nurses who said lots of inappropriate things throughout my treatment. Sort of, I think, in between even, the stages you go through where you have to go through all the scans to make sure it hasn't spread anywhere. There was another nurse within that department that asked me if I had children, and I said no, who told me that it was okay because I could always adopt.
Right, because it's really up to other people to tell, who do we tell? Who do we walk up to and go, you can adopt? Technically, anyone can adopt. And yet, when someone's in that situation, that kind of entitled, you can adopt, it really can miss the mark. How did it make you feel?
I think there's so many things. So I worked in children's services. So I actually worked in a service with young people leaving care. And my understanding from working in the sector was that obviously it would greatly reduce my chances of doing it. But because I worked in the sector, one of the things I did when I was diagnosed is I came home and I rang the social services and I went, will it rule me out? I want to check. Although I work in the sector, I don't work in fostering or adoption, and I want to know what my chances are. But actually, since then, since we've gone down the route of going to the fertility clinic and going through fostering and adoption routes, it's really interesting actually when you go to adoption, even though my oncologist has told me for years he will support me on an application, as will my GP. We haven't even got past the initial sort of phone call.
Yeah.
hi, my name is, and can I tell you that I've had cancer? And then they just go, okay, lovely, thanks very much for your phone call.
Yep. Yeah.
So, I think there's one thing on paper where social services can say that it won't rule you out, but actually in reality, you can be fighting a losing battle with an individual. And I think that's true of our health professionals when we're looking at those two nurses who are quite happy to want to make things better and reassure you or do things in a way that is their personal opinion in a crisis moment. And I think it boils down to them feeling, how do we cope? How do we cope with this situation? It was the same for the doctor and those two nurses. How do we cope in this uncomfortable situation?
Yeah, I mean, definitely people flounder and say really bizarre things. I was once told, did I consider getting a monkey? Yeah. I was like, what? Like, I mean, have you been watching too much Early Friends with like Ross and his monkey? Like, what? Like, it just almost made my head explode. The things that people say, and I think that, there may be an intention. They think, oh, well, you can always adopt. I know for myself, there was a very big difference between me wanting to have my own child and me wanting to adopt. In my personal experience, not putting anything on anybody else, but I felt they were two different things.
They are.
And you can have a grief for one and still do the other. Lots of people do very successfully. But when it's kind of like, oh, it's kind of the same, it doesn't, to me, it didn't feel the same. Gemma, I'd love to bring you in here. How's it been listening to Amanda and Katy?
Sorry, I can't stop thinking about how they said, have you thought about having a monkey?
Yeah.
On that one. But yeah, really hard to hear your stories, ladies. And, something I noticed was, I think with breast cancer, just to give you some personal background about myself, I've had 2 separate primaries. I've had a cancer in my womb and a cancer in my ovary. So I never had this incredibly difficult decision that you were both faced with in a very short space of time, where they've said, you've got to decide, do you want to do this IVF or not? Because for me, there was a slight chance I could have had IVF, but it would have upstaged my cancer. So in a way, I think that actually made it a little bit easier for me, if anything, because I didn't have that either I do this or I do that, such a life-changing decision at a time where my head was in, sort of all over the shop. I really don't know how I would have coped with that. So in my case, it was quite an easy one. They were like, yes, it could cause the cancer to go up a stage. I was like, right, well, absolutely not. I can't be doing that. And they didn't really push the matter at all, because it wouldn't have been very wise for me to have IVF with ovarian cancer and womb cancer. It could have been a complete disaster. But I think that door was closed for me, and it was very final. And some people think that that's harder, but for me personally, I think it's a little bit easier, because that shred of hope has been removed. I'm not chasing it. It's like, okay, that door's closed and it's a shame, and I am upset about it, and I am disappointed, and it's okay to be disappointed, but at least it's not, wondering or sort of putting my life on hold, thinking, oh, there's a slight chance that, this egg I could be fertile, or I could keep this over it. There was just none of that. It was like, okay, I'm not having biological children. My body's never going to carry children. But yeah, sorry, just going back to your question. What exactly was your question again? Sorry, menopause brain.
I so relate.
I digressed already. I was like, I'm definitely going to digress.
I so relate to menopause brain. Thank you for sharing that. So yeah, having 2 gynecological cancers and having that choice taken away. Where had you been before? Did you think that you would have kids?
Yeah, so I was 100% planning on having kids. I wasn't in a huge rush for it, I have to be honest. And one of the many things I sort of think about or I go over in my head is, should I have had children earlier? Would things have been different? Should I have spent, my whole life taking birth control just so I could go on holidays and party and be irresponsible, and where I could have been having children. I have a good career, but it wasn't anything like woo, like a huge career. I'm not like a politician or an actress. Do you know what I mean? I'm not Angelina Jolie. So I was like, should I have done something differently? But yeah, like similar to what you ladies described, like my diagnosis took a very, very long time. I was in and out of the hospital having very invasive procedures for over 2 years. And they just kept sending me back to the GP and signing me out of care and saying, nothing's wrong. They knew I had a polyp in my womb for 2 years. Even by the time they realised I had womb cancer, they were still sort of saying to me, oh, do you want to go on the coil? We can salvage your fertility. And yeah, like I say, when I finally went to get my eggs, because I was planning on getting my eggs frozen, funnily enough, that's when I actually got diagnosed with ovarian cancer. I thought, oh yeah, great, I'll freeze my eggs if I have that option. They were saying my womb cancer was very treatable. It was early stage. I was like, great, I'll have a hysterectomy, freeze my eggs. I got to Manchester St Mary's, and she basically looked at my eggs. I was incredibly fertile. There was nothing wrong with me in that regard anyway. Like I had like 15 follicles, I think. But she went into like one ovary and she said, oh, I can't take eggs out of this. I think you've got another cancer, or I think your cancer's spread out the womb. And I think at that point I was like, okay, like the conversation's changed. It's a lot more serious than I thought. Just take everything out. And they were like, well, we can do the egg freezing. I was like, no. Me and my husband sat in the car, and I said, because I sort of wanted to give him some time to voice what he would want, and he would have absolutely loved children. But straight away he was like, no, your health comes before your fertility, Gemma. Like, we're not risking your life for it, sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, I always planned on having children. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't really disappointed. And like you, Amanda, I have all these thoughts like, oh, well, me and my husband can spend £5,000 on a trip to Vegas now, and we can travel, we can have all these wonderful drinks and go out with friends, and I can have this really rich quality of life still. And I can be kind of optimistic and positive about that. But then there's also part of me that's like, oh, I'm so kind of sad about this. Like, especially when I see my sister and my niece and nephew, I'm like, all those little potential persons, all those potential little Gemmas are just lying in a biobank somewhere, like frozen. So yeah, disappointment is certainly the word. But
you had shared with me that you had sort of returned to some previous coping mechanisms, and what you realised is in this sadness, they weren't working for you anymore. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, when I first got diagnosed, like I went a little bit off the rails, as you do. Basically, I've always been somebody who's quite enjoyed, like, I've always worked very hard, but I've always partied quite hard as well. I've always loved to shop. Always loved to sort of go out and socialise. And I think what I did was, when I first got diagnosed, I just had no idea. I didn't have any healthy coping strategies. I wasn't somebody that meditated. I wasn't somebody that really exercised very much. Like, I exercised a bit, but like nothing proper really. Like, nothing sufficient. I was one of those people that did all the hours in the office, all the overtime, and then went wild at the weekend and blew all my money. And I basically was just doing a lot of things that had kind of worked for me when nothing was wrong, So if I'd had a stressful day at work, a pint down the pub with some colleagues was really helpful. If me and my husband were having like a bit of a rough time, I don't know, like going to the casino and having a bit of a flutter was helpful. If I was feeling a bit down about myself or having a bit of a down day, going shopping for some makeup or an outfit made me feel kind of good. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to feel so much better when I'm wearing this outfit. And I sort of started doing that to the excess, to the point where I just ended up with loads of credit card debt. I was winning quite a lot of money at the casino, but I wasn't enjoying it at all. Like, I wasn't excited by it. It just felt so empty. And I was going out for drinks, and like, I wouldn't say I was drinking too much, but I wasn't, because I was so emotionally destabilized. I was just waking up feeling a million times more awful than I would had everything been going swimmingly, like my anxiety was just sky high. So yeah, I was basically just using strategies that had worked for me before cancer, after cancer. And I soon realized that that wasn't getting me anywhere. I was just getting myself into like deeper problems. And that's where I basically sort of accessed all the help I could get. I did like the Shine Breakout program. I got counseling. I went to CBT. I just took anything I could. And slowly I started sort of swapping these kind of excessive hedonistic habits for things that were a lot more healthy. All the stuff that I'd sort of not frowned upon, but I'd not bothered with before, like the meditation, the prayer apps, just anything I could do that was kind of a healthier way of coping with my grief and my disappointment and my anxiety I was doing. And yeah, slowly I started to get quite a lot better. I'm not going to say that like I'm 100%, like I'm not a Buddhist monk or anything like that. Like, I'm not, like, I've still got certain things that I do that probably aren't very sensible, but I'd say I'm certainly in a better space emotionally.
Yeah, and you mentioned, grief, and grief is messy, and we're often presented with that linear model of, 7 stages, but actually, yeah, it is a cluster. And, what you were saying about even winning at the casino and feeling nothing, feeling empty, that numbness, that dissociation, is as much a part of grief as anger or tears or, all those other ones that are sort of more recognizable. And I think one of the things that's really tough is that when there's cancer as well, people around can kind of acknowledge the cancer, but not necessarily always hold space for that loss of the children that you wanted to have. To them, sometimes that's an invisible grief, but for you, that can feel, and I could hear it when you were talking, Gemma, about the little Gemmas, like it's a very tangible loss to you. I'd like to put it out to all of you. Did you feel understood by those closest to you? So going to Katy and then Amanda and then back to you, Gemma.
I don't think I've ever felt fully understood by anybody close around me. And I think that's because of masking that we do. So I mentioned before my brother, and they have 3 children. And, I always, when I was with them when I was younger, I was always like, I'd be lovely to be in that position, but I was never in a relationship, Again, that goes back to something Amanda was saying before, we can have relationships, but it doesn't necessarily mean. And it's just one of those. And I think that I was always someone that's like, well, I won't have kids. It's fine. I won't have kids, and, find reasons not to have children and sort of do that. So maybe that's not necessarily other people not understanding me. That's the mask I wore, and maybe not understanding myself to be mature enough to have worked out how I could put myself in a better place in order to have actually become a mother when I was younger. So I think there's that. My family are also going through their own grief for that. So I think certainly my mother has mentioned sort of, in recent years that she would have loved me and my husband to have been parents. So the fact that we hadn't got round to that, or we'd made decisions not to do that in the 5 years prior to my diagnosis, again, it's one of those things. But I think for me, the real strength that my husband and I have is that we talk about cancer every day. We have a strong relationship, and even if we don't get each other, or sometimes I was saying to you, Tatum, on the phone about, when we went through all this thing about fostering and adoption and everything, about the rejection and about the grief that we continually went through. We were continually on this cycle of it, because you'd build yourself up to open yourself up to somebody again, and then to be knocked back again, it just got too much for him. And he just got to the stage where he said, I can't do this anymore. We've got to stop. So I have to respect that. I have to respect him and his feelings in amongst everything else. So I don't think it's just about whether or not I felt understood by other people. It's about how other people process their grief, and about how I understand myself.
Yeah. And there's something about, I can hear in your husband almost calling it like this is the end of the thing, and there can be pain in extending the possibility. And I know for myself, I had one chance to be pregnant, and I also had an estrogen positive cancer, so it was, quite risky, and I lost the pregnancy, but I had 6 embryos, and I paid every year hundreds and hundreds of pounds for them to stay in storage, and knowing that I couldn't use them again, and still not being able to let that go. And there was something about marking that ending that for me was quite a line in the sand, and this big, like Gemma, I'd really planned to have children. So it was like this, this end of this sort of dream alternate life that I thought was maybe in a parallel universe. Like maybe if I went behind a door on the other side, I'd be a mum sitting in a PTA meeting or beside a football pitch. Or what mum would I have been? Would I have been a great party host mum? Like would I have thrown, or would I have gone, oh no, sod these gift bags? Like who would I have been? And one day will I turn a corner and will I see her? Will I meet her? And I decided to unfreeze them and bury them. And as tough as that was, there was something about an end that was marked, because I think it is often this invisible, there's often not, a headstone. There isn't a place to, where the ashes are. There aren't these formal ritualistic, conventions that we can follow that we do in all these other forms of grief, where people come together and they talk about the person that they've lost. And it's both the person that you expected to hold in this world and look after, and who you were going to be doing it. So it's like such a combination effect. And Amanda, did you feel understood? Did you feel like you could talk to people?
It's tricky. I think I have a mum and a sister, and my dad died very suddenly when I was 23. And that was an enormous trauma for us all. He just dropped dead. And we've always been very tight-knit. And my mum, it was very intense, me being the next to really bad news. And funny enough, just before I got ill, we had this really nice Christmas, 2016. And my mum had said something to my sister about, if Amanda ever got ill, I would never cope. It's like her, I'm the youngest, and you're sort of treated with kid gloves, really. And I remember my sister always being like, talk to me, don't talk to mum, I'm fine, I can deal with it. And then she got really ill with shingles. And I was like, it's really, really intense. The hardest thing I had to do was ring my mum. When I told her, she just went silent. And luckily I rang we have very close neighbours we've grown up with. So I rang my neighbours first and was like, come and hold mum, because and she's kept it all inside so much. And she's been so wonderful about never saying that she wanted grandchildren, because my sister's always been adamant that she doesn't want children. She has a much older stepchild because she married somebody much older than her. But for her, it was very black and white. She thinks the world's a terrible place. I do not want to bring children into it. And it's funny because then sometimes she sort of co-opts me into that point of view. And I'm like, that's not my point of view. I possibly would have liked to have really had children. And so I don't know anyone a lot of my friends don't have children, but not because they had cancer.
Right.
Dealing with the isolation of cancer and the isolation of infertility.
Yeah.
And some of my friends who are childless are just so caring for me. I've got one amazing friend. I went to a party once and I absolutely collapsed. I just had no energy. And she was so perceptive and kind. She got all my stuff together, realised what was happening to me. I have friends like that, and she rescued me, put me in an Uber, took me home. And they give me their time, but we don't talk about not having kids. And I have other friends who've had kids through artificial insemination. So they are single parents, women on their own, but they had that choice. So that's been quite hard. And then some who have been amazingly generous and, allowed me into their family lives, allowed me to have very close relationships with their children, which has been kind of a replacement for me. But I don't know anybody who's in that situation. And so like when COVID hit, all these things that had held me together, my amazing friends, my godkids who are like my own kids, I love them with all my heart. They call me Auntie Amanda. I can pick them up at the school gate. It just went. And that didn't happen for any of my other friends. So definitely my friends who were on their own, but they were still working. I got the text saying I had to stay indoors. I lost my job because my job was a receptionist job, because I was just trying to get back on my feet with my exhaustion and stuff. I had this nice 3-day-a-week receptionist job. Nobody needs receptionists anymore. They were like, we don't want to touch you. Don't give us coffees. We don't want any of that. And so suddenly I was at home and totally on my own. No work, no friends, none of the kids that I sort of filled my life with to try and, keep in contact with that side of life. And you're looking online at everyone who's juggling things. And I could see that some of my friends were having a horrific time. The ones who were on their own, or the ones who both parents were working. It was an absolute nightmare. But I was just sat in this huge void and no one else was going through that. And actually, funnily enough, that's when I went on Facebook and joined some Facebook groups. I mean, I was already a part of Shine, but I never checked my phone that often. And now I've really found support through cancer groups, because that's where I was like, is anyone else completely alone at home?
Yeah.
And all those things that have been compromised anyway, because I didn't have the immune system to be around a lot of kids, but I could be auntie and I could come and help. And I was like, you guys go out for dinner. I'm very happy to look after these kids. I love them. I couldn't do any of that. And so, yeah. And then on the other hand, like I said, I was living with my mum. It's very intense. And if she sees me cry, it hurts her. It physically hurts her. And she's so good. And she doesn't say that she's upset. And I think she's not too fussed about grandkids. And I try really hard to bring my godkids around as much as possible, because they love my mum. She's so quiet. Like, she's got this shed in our garden. And my godson loves it. And he plays in it all the time. So she made a little wooden sign and it says his shed.
Aww.
And he loves it and he brings it up all the time. He does little pictures for her. But so I try and get her to have some of that. But it's very hard, isn't it? If you just want to have a good old sob and your mum, just to get it out, you might be feeling okay, but you know what? You just need a good sob to know that you're sort of being watched by your mum, who's not going to be a grandma.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to ring up my sister necessarily. It's a lot to take on.
It can be so much to hold, and often we do hold it alone. I think grief by its nature is lonely. Like, I do think there is an essential part of that, but I think it's an extra layer of isolation on top of that. I know for me, where it often comes out is watching TV shows, and there's the ones where they're scanning. For the ultrasound. Yeah, I can lose it really quickly in front of almost anyone. That's where I can't hold it in. And I suppose it's like everyone has their own kind of image of what it looks like. Does the grief lessen, or do we learn to carry it? Like, do we expand around it and become big enough? But then there are those moments where it just comes in really acutely.
Yeah, and that's interesting actually, because I find that quite isolating in itself, like for many reasons, but with cancer, so much drama and TV and things that you relax to are about life going on as normal. You know, this leads to this drama, or cancer's being used for its drama. You know, oh, she's got cancer, and I feel like I just pick up books and go, this means nothing to me. This means nothing to me. And not with everything, but it is interesting, even that, like when you relax and the stories that we tell each other, you're not included in those stories. And I think as a woman of a certain age, like I'm a woman in my 40s without a child, that's hugely isolating. I have had cancer. I can't do a sort of big woohoo job. And, you know, I'm not that career woman who didn't have the kids. And I think, yeah, that you're like, where's my story? I can't see that. And it's interesting. I kind of like listening to the Shine podcast, but I also found myself listening to a lot of disability podcasts, because I do think I now have like absolutely chronic anxiety and fatigue and the menopausal symptoms. And I think it's because it's about being excluded, you know, so obviously that's not as severe as, say, you know, not being able to use it, being paraplegic or something. But the stories they tell really chime with me. Mm-hmm. And I never would have thought that. Like, I'm listening to all these disability podcasts and it's just like, yes, oh, yes, that makes sense. Yes, that's me. And that's really where I find a very comfortable home, because it is suddenly about being not the mainstream, being excluded. You know, like I have a real bee in my bonnet about work. You know, so many people can't work because they're just a bit tired, and the workplace is so brutal these days. You know, I was chatting to a friend of mine who works for CAB, and he got me to check a job ad because, you know, I was like, sorry, it's slightly going off tangent, but it's like hit the ground running, go the extra mile, self-starter. And I just look at things like that and I'm like, well, I'm clever. I've got a degree. I've got an MA. I've got years of experience. I've been through cancer. I have loads of stuff to give you, but that scares me. I'm not going to apply for that job.
I mean, I'm exhausted just hearing about that advert. Yeah.
And I think people just cut and paste, but it's so chronic how one little thing like fatigue just excludes you from so much. And add to that, you know, you can't fit into the sort of mother and baby group. You know, you haven't got these little markers or these groups in society. And I was 37. I was like, I'm young. And all my friends are so thoughtful, but they are busy with their kids and they are leading their lives and they are getting on with these groups. And, you know, they've been very generous to me.
Something about being on the outside of that, you know, like when everyone is, everyone else seems to have this experience of this whole world, this whole life that, like, for me, I don't have any access to. But before we wrap up today, I would love to hear from each of you. One thing that you could, if you could go back in time and just whisper a piece of advice to yourself, kind of at the beginning of this, you know, the beginning of where the loss was for you, what might you tell yourself? So it could be advice, it could be reassurance, it could be anything. And if we could start with Gemma, that would be great.
I think I would just say that, like, it does get better, first of all. Like, I know it's really cliche sort of thing to say, but I think time is a healer. I think going back to what, I don't know if it was you, Tatum, that was saying, you know, about the aloneness. And when I first got diagnosed and I went through this fertility thing, I felt very, very alone. I thought about all my friends and how they would all start having children and I would be so left out. And I try to have like a lot of grace with people as well, because ultimately this experience is my subjective individual experience. So nobody can really go through it and feel it in the same way that I am. So I can't really expect them to sort of understand. But through connection and through meeting people much like yourselves who, yes, your experiences and your stories are different, but I think the pain is the same in many, many ways. And I can relate with something each of you have individually said. I think I would have reached out and connected like a lot earlier, because it's healed me like so much. And I think, if I could say something to myself going back, I would have been like, don't suffer. Like, you know, you don't have to be like this big existentialist, like suffering alone. Do you know what I mean? Like, go out there, speak to people, reach out, and I don't really have anything to build on that. Is that
I
right?
love that. It's so powerful. It really is in that lonely place to then be able to, talk to other people that also understand that lonely place. There was such power in that. And I'm really, really glad that, you're finding that, Gemma, and that it's been useful to chat to other people kind of in similar-ish experiences. Katy, what would you, if you could whisper something to yourself?
I think for me, what I want to say is that there's actually no one piece of advice. And the reason I'm saying that is that's because other people get it wrong. We've already said that people can sort of get to the stage where they say things because they want to make things better. So for me, I don't think there's ever one piece of advice. I think it's about how we learn to cope with adjustments.
Yeah.
So we're going through another change again at the moment, and it's around me getting out the house more. And actually, my husband's struggling with that because there's actually a change in our relationship and there's a change in our day-to-day lives. And I think it's about generally how we cope with those adjustments, whether that's as individuals or as a couple, or if you see my husband and I as a family, or I'm sure there's plenty of listeners who have had children and then had a diagnosis, which means that they don't have any further children. We're all talking it from a perspective of not having any children. I know a lot of our listeners are not in that situation.
Yeah, secondary infertility can be just as hard.
Yeah, and I think it's about how we all choose to cope with adjustments as individuals, as couples, as families, and within what support networks that we have.
Thank you, Katy, for sharing that. And Amanda, do you have anything of any kind? It could be advice, it could be a joke, it could be anything that you'd like to whisper back to yourself. It could be
my top tip is don't get cancer, but that one is gone. No, I definitely am still in a process of acceptance. I hear all the time about people going, I'm actually glad I got cancer and it's changed me. And I find that hard because I see how much pain it's brought to the people I love the most in the world. But I do realise that in order to move forward, that is important. And so I guess it would just be kind to yourself, like how upset I got about making those decisions. There are no right decisions. None of this is easy. And like you said, some people have kids and find it really hard and wish they hadn't. We all have to walk through certain doors and it means closing off other doors. And, you could have 3 kids and just grieve for actually your independence and everything that life gave you. Or you can not have kids and you're grieving for the family that you never had. And, it's just give yourself time. I still am sort of thinking it's 5 years down the line. Why am I not better? But I think something really pertinent you said earlier, where you were just saying it's so much to take on in a week. And I think that's why cancer is quite unique, because then the fallout just rolls on and on, because actually not having children was something that maybe I would have dealt with within 5, 6, 10 years slowly. And you were given 2 days. And so then you have to give yourself the time afterwards. And I think the same, not having kids at 40, 45, 50, 55 is very different. And you will be grieving all those different things at different stages.
Absolutely.
And, that's just something that you have to process. And I don't always do it, but yeah, my tip is just be kind to yourself and give yourself.
I'm loving all of these. So we've got kind of connection. There's no one bit of advice, and that it's a little bit about figuring out how to roll with adjustments and then being compassionate. I think that those are amazing takeaways. Thank you so much, all of you, for chatting with me today. And thank you so much to Radio Facilities for being our awesome sponsors. And thanks to all of you for listening. Till next time, bye.
Not your grandma's cancer show.